Lost regards. Naturally, Edgar was aware that Constable would be seated at the same supper table. But the younger Earl had no reason to run and hide. Though meeting him would no doubt be uncomfortable, Edgar had no intention of withdrawing while he waited for a chance to speak with Lady Ortred and the arrival of the very important guest. And so he sat down at the dining table. Constable, who was already seated, glared at him sharply. "It's certainly a surprise to see you here, Ashenbert. I wonder whether you've had a change of heart. If you are here to apologize to me and wish for my dear sister to assist in bringing you and my daughter together, then I shan't stand in your way." Edgar smirked inwardly. "Ah, yes. Lady Ortred is your sister, isn't she? Although I understand that her late husband wasn't particularly fond of you." Constable was visibly displeased. "My sister and I were estranged. It was nothing deeper than that. I do have to wonder about your reasons for wishing to reconcile with her ladyship now. There are rumors circulating that you have your eye on her fortune." The older Earl was growing more disgruntled by the second. "Is this an attempt to humiliate me? I am simply repeating the rumors that I have heard. I might ask the same of you. Why have you made contact with my dear sister? One hears of these scoundrels who attempt to seduce elderly widows for the sake of gaining a better reputation. My fiancé will soon be coming to receive an education from Lady Ortred. I have come to make her ladyship's acquaintance beforehand." Although it was rumored that Edgar was engaged, Constable seemed surprised to hear it confirmed by the man himself. He had fallen silent. Unfortunately, any expectations of a peaceful supper were cut short. "You are unscrupulous beyond belief," Constable cried suddenly. "You are engaged, and yet you would write to my daughter Anne. Can you really be certain that everything Lady Lucinda wrote in her diary is the truth? Diaries are not meant for the eyes of others, and I am sure that some people use them to explore fantasy. My daughter's dissipated fantasies could not have come from nothing." "I see. So either your daughter has been partaking in dissipated activities, or she has merely been having dissipated fantasies. Would it not be more comforting to believe the latter?" His face bright red, Constable shot to his feet. "I am afraid to say that this supper has become unpleasant. Do not think that you will get away with your impropriety, Ashenbert." With that, the older man left the dining room, leaving the remainder of his food uneaten. While Edgar would rather not make enemies out of fellow noblemen, in this instance he considered it unavoidable. Quite apart from anything else, he was totally innocent of what Constable was accusing him of. And even if he weren't, he was confident that he could spin things so that he was in the right. He had plenty of tools at his disposal. Even if Constable insisted on creating a scandal out of the issue, Edgar knew how to fight back in a way that would prevent the older man from ever being able to show his face in noble society again. However, he really didn't want Lydia to learn of this. It seemed that she was finally starting to believe that his feelings for her were genuine, and this risked it all coming to naught. Fortunately, or so he thought, he still had a few days leeway before she was due to arrive. "At last, I am able to enjoy the food before me," Edgar murmured to himself, calling the butler over to pour him some more champagne. He studied the liquid. "Yes, this is just the quality I would expect from Lady Ortred." "You flatter us, my lord. The food is just as excellent. It truly is a shame that her ladyship no longer hosts parties since being widowed. I've heard that the cook's food and the overall hospitality here is of a level that one is hard-pressed to find at other estates. Her ladyship may indeed not host such parties, but we see countless visitors who come out of adoration for her. Our duty is to work to such standards to ensure that her ladyship's reputation does not come under scrutiny." Though he spoke humbly, the butler seemed undoubtedly pleased with Edgar's praise. It was often said that in order to enjoy one's stay at another's estate, it was important to leave a favorable impression on the staff. More so, even, than on the master and mistress themselves. Not only that, but Edgar reckoned that his own good impression would work to damage the impression of the haughty Lord Constable. Slighting the estate staff was unwise. The opinion of a long-standing, senior servant was capable of influencing that of the master or mistress themselves. At this rate, Edgar should be able to ensure that Lady Ortred would take his side if Lucinda's mystery correspondence became an issue. "Might I ask for a splash more of this Genovese sauce?" said Edgar. The butler shot a glance at the servant who was standing with the tureen in hand, only for it to go over the latter's head. Only when the staff member next to him whispered Billy did he snap back to his senses. He must have been relatively new to his position. When he eventually did come over, he was rather clumsy in his use of the spoon. Gazing at his scraggy hands, Edgar had the sense that something wasn't quite right. They were quite obviously hands that handled weaponry, not those suited to service. Annie was tying Lucinda's hair. She picked up the brush as carefully as she could. "Ouch, that hurts." The maid jumped, but then lowered her head slightly in apology. Lucinda grew irritated. It didn't matter how carefully Annie was working, she was making a pig's ear of it. "You need to be making these curls neater. Do not forget that I am going to be meeting Lord Ashenbert." Lucinda had been looking into where he would be calling and when. The connections between noble houses formed a complex web. All she needed to do was visit a house he was acquainted with and ask. Someone there would inevitably know something. The Ashenbert estate was of interest to most everybody. Even just paying attention to hearsay could teach one which houses the Earl was close to or with whom he had recently been in frequent contact with, as evidenced by how often servants were seen coming and going from his estate. As such, Lucinda had learned that he was due at Lady Ortred's estate today, and she was eager not to waste the opportunity. She changed her own plans at the last minute in order to engineer a chance encounter. "Not that ornament, Annie. I said I wanted the coral one." Flustered, the maid searched around for the coral hair ornament. As completely useless as she was, Lucinda had grown fond of the recent hire. She didn't need her lady's maid to be clever or competent. Annie was slow and unable to ponder complex matters, and that was fine by Lucinda. Best of all, she was incapable of spilling secrets. She wouldn't tell that the girl's diary was filled with lies, nor would she explain that Lucinda had deliberately let her father see its pages to make him think she was in a relationship with Lord Ashenbert. As far as the Earl was concerned, Lucinda was a pitiable girl who had been taken advantage of. When she led him to believe that even a kiss was enough to agitate her, he was bound to pity her even more. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror. It was a perfectly timid and fragile smile, and she knew well that it enhanced her beauty. She was confident that she would be able to arouse any gentleman's interest after her debut. "While I am sure that this knowledge will prove useless to you, Annie, I want you to know that marriage can be likened to competition. The girl who captures the heart of the most sought-after bachelor is the winner. Having an esteemed husband is enough to earn the respect of the upper class at large." Annie had at last found the coral hair ornament, which she quickly put into place. His appearance matters just as much as his position, of course. And Lord Ashenbert is impeccably handsome. There are several girls who harbor a secret affection for him. Lucinda stood up to scrutinize her dress in the full-length mirror. The skirt's organdy frills swayed gently when she turned. "But if I am too passive, I shall never become any closer to him. Lord Ashenbert, more than most, is constantly approached by girls who wish to know him better. With this, I should now have a clear advantage over them." Marrying a man who was the envy of everyone was the perfect form of revenge. The other girls all thought that Lucinda couldn't possibly marry well due to her mother's station. She would have them eating humble pie. She had latched onto her lie as soon as she'd learned that her initials were identical to those of Lord Ashenbert's fiancé. It had been exhilarating to be at the center of all those envious stares, even if she knew she was being dishonest. It was too late to back out now. Her only option was to turn her fantasy into reality. She had intended for her aunt to assist, but that would probably be impossible if Lady Ortred was ill. Lucinda would have to put her plan into motion by herself. The only question that remains is what to do about his lordship's fiancée. If the rumors were to be believed, she wasn't of noble birth. After all, no one in the upper class had been overheard discussing such an engagement. "I shan't have anything to fear if she is a common girl." Her mother notwithstanding, Lucinda was undoubtedly the daughter to an earl. She had much more value than a commoner, plain and simple. Not to mention that her aunt was Lady Ortred, a woman who had dealings with the royal family. Lucinda was of the belief that a gentleman's heart could be swayed by appearance and prestige alone. When Edgar returned to his chamber after supper, he found Lucinda waiting there for him. More specifically, she was in his dressing room, which doubled as a lounge. That did nothing to change the fact that it was a gentleman's private space. The majority of noble girls wouldn't dare enter, with or without a maid. Raven was standing idly in one corner of the room. "Please forgive me for calling at this late hour, Lord Ashenbert," Lucinda said. "I was under the impression that you'd foregone supper in order to rest," Edgar replied, standing in the doorway without closing it. "I dearly wished to speak with you once more. I believe it is God's will that we just so happened to be staying at this estate during the same period." Edgar would rather have been considered a heathen than worship the God that had arranged this encounter. "I am in love with you," Lucinda went on. "Why, thank you. I couldn't simply allow you to slip through my fingers. The gentleman with whom you exchanged letters and fell in love wasn't me. Remember? I replied to them because I believed it was you. In that case, I can only apologize. I am already engaged." Though Lucinda dropped her gaze forlornly, she wasted no time in carrying on. "I have heard that you have had many love affairs, my lord. I am sure that you are presently seeing many lovers as well. It is not uncommon for men to see other women even once they are engaged, but I suppose your fiancé must not approve of that, seeing as you haven't sent any further letters." "I never sent you any letters in the first place. I, on the other hand, am much more forgiving." She obviously wasn't listening. Edgar was being cornered by a most vexing girl indeed. Perplexed, he ran his fingers through his hair. "You wouldn't be so forgiving if you truly loved me. I adore you from the bottom of my heart. That, I am sure of." Lucinda stepped gracefully toward him till she was right by his side. She lowered her gaze and whispered, "If your lordship were to kiss me, I would be able to tell whether the gentleman I met with that night was you or not. You are a bolder girl than I gave you credit for. Indeed, falling in love emboldens one." Her request was undoubtedly a ploy to make him kiss her. However, and much to his discomfort, Edgar did not find it unpleasant to be openly desired, even under such a pretext. What was wrong with indulging a girl who sought a fleeting romance from him, even if she was in love only with the idea of love? And if they became lovers, there would be no reason not to give her everything she wanted, from kisses to time spent alone together. Edgar looked down at Lucinda, who had her eyes closed and was stretching up slightly. He couldn't help but wonder why she wasn't Lydia. He wished that Lydia would want him like this, even if she felt obliged to hide it behind an endearing excuse. Lucinda claimed to be in love with him. He wondered whether Lydia loved him just as much. Perhaps it was more of a tender affection that she felt for him, knowing his weaknesses and suffering as she did. "My lord," Raven said firmly. He must have feared that Edgar was at risk of mindlessly kissing the girl in front of him. Or so the Earl thought until he raised his head and noticed his servant's gaze was focused beyond the open doorway. Edgar unconsciously caught Lucinda as she fell against him, then turned as best he could to find a maid standing in the door. Only it wasn't a maid. It was Lydia, rooted to the spot, her eyes wide with shock. Forgive me." Lowering her head, she hurried away. What is Lydia doing here? He didn't know, but he did know that he couldn't let her be. "Deal with this for me, Raven." Pushing Lucinda away, Edgar rushed after Lydia. What on earth did I just witness? As Lydia ran, the image of Edgar and Lucinda on the verge of kissing flashed through her mind, sending her spiraling into confusion. When Lucinda had spoken about her fiancé, had she meant Edgar? It wasn't out of the question. The Earl had had many lovers in the past, and it was quite possible that he had gotten overly zealous in exchanging letters with Lucinda and that they had become overly flirtatious. But even if that were true, the fact remained that he had told Lydia he'd cut ties with all other women. It had looked like Lucinda was being the insistent one. Perhaps Edgar had tried to break things off with her, but she was refusing to let him. She had seemed to be taking an assertive attitude with the way she had closed her eyes first. Though Lucinda didn't seem that far removed from Lydia in age, she would have learned long ago what being a lady meant. She knew how to present herself as beautifully as possible. She would already have been thinking about marriage and knew what the ideal picture of a nobleman's wife was. There was no doubt either that she knew much better than Lydia how to behave when one was being courted. Lydia couldn't imagine herself waiting for a kiss like Lucinda had. Lucinda was far superior than her in so many ways that Lydia could not avoid the crushing weight of defeat. She sought refuge in a dark hall and, finding it deserted, was finally able to pause for breath. Her eyes found the apron she was wearing, a sight that stilled her thoughts all of a sudden. If she was honest with herself, it was quite possible that she was being ridiculous. She had to be mad to compare herself to a beautiful girl born into nobility. And Edgar may well have found his heart swayed by the advances of someone so perfect. When she considered what she might do in such a situation, she was too weary to come to any other conclusion than that she would just have to accept it. Just as confirmation of their engagement had thrown her into bewilderment, Edgar must have been starting to realize that she was unsuitable to become a countess. That must be it. Despite Edgar's apparent enthusiasm, he is exasperated at my inability to properly prepare for our union. She heard his voice then. That isn't so. In truth, I do not want anything more than for you to become a part of my household. As Lydia stepped back, he stepped forward until she had her back to the window and he was standing immediately before her. Why do you keep your distance from me? Edgar asked. They were in a dimly lit room with no one else around, and it made Lydia vaguely uneasy. While she knew she oughtn't think of her fiancé as dangerous, it seemed to be something instinctual that was making her act this way. I am surprised to see you here, Lydia. I thought that you were due to arrive next week. He was probably upset at her for failing to keep in touch with him. On top of that, he must have been vexed at the guilt he was made to feel because he had met with Lucinda without knowing that Lydia was here. Whenever Edgar was in such a poor mood, he took on a quietly aggressive air. It was the reason Lydia didn't feel entirely comfortable at present. It was also why she unconsciously turned her gaze away from him. It was a very sudden decision. Her Grace's eldest daughter was taken ill, so it was decided that I would impose on Lady Ortred earlier than planned. I see. Edgar placed his hand on her shoulder. As for the young lady you saw me with, she seems rather fond of you, Lydia stammered. She is under a misapprehension. She has been corresponding with a gentleman who shares his initials with mine, and she believes him to be me. Lydia resisted the urge to ask whether he was certain he hadn't been the one writing letters to Lucinda. Though I have told her that it wasn't me, she is refusing to believe it, and now I find myself in a fix. She even came to my chamber without permission, as you saw. Be that as it may, it hadn't seemed like he was treating her like a stranger. However, as long as she is Lady Ortred's niece, I have to maintain a certain level of cordiality. He was preempting Lydia's doubts and making excuses to refute them, something that only made her doubt him all the more. That is all there is to it. Please do not think that my eyes are wandering. There is no room in my heart for anyone other than you. I know, Lydia responded after a beat. Since their engagement had been confirmed, she had decided she must trust in every one of his words, no matter how suspicious they seemed. You aren't angry with me? Edgar asked. What is there to be angry about? His eyes seemed to be searching hers for something. Is he going to kiss me? Lydia started to panic. She wasn't like Lucinda. She didn't have it in her to simply close her eyes and wait. It was dark and they were alone. Edgar being Edgar, he wouldn't refrain. But Lydia never knew what to do when he kissed her in such circumstances. There was something suffocating about it. She was struggling to hide how flustered she was, and she was sure that he could sense she was becoming restless. Edgar took his hand away from her. As uncomfortable as she was more bewildered by the fact that he wasn't kissing her, and so she found herself glancing at his face. He still seemed very much put out. Why aren't you angry? You are well within your rights to suspect something. Unsure of the intention behind his words, Lydia remained silent. What you witnessed didn't call for you to apologize and flee. You saw another woman in your lover's chamber. You ought to have struck me and chased that woman out. He spoke as though it was something that happened to him on a regular basis. If you would lose your temper, I would apologize as many times as it took for you to forgive me. Then we would put it behind us. Isn't that how these things work? But you haven't done anything wrong, she stammered, trailing off. You are not jealous at all? It isn't that I am not jealous, exactly. She paused. It would be strange for a maid to display such outrage. It was only then that Edgar seemed to remember how she was dressed. Oh, yes. Why are you dressed like that? Are you not supposed to be here as a guest? I thought the Duchess introduced you. I am not entirely sure, but I trust in Lady Orchard's intentions. It was her ladyship's idea. Is she really having you perform the duties of a maid? Her ladyship is presently unable to converse at length. I suspect that the housekeeper, Mrs. Boyle, was instructed to treat me as a maid before my arrival. With a sigh, Edgar took one of Lydia's braids into his hand. As endearing as this hairstyle is, I cannot say that I am all too happy with you being made to work. Let us return to London post-haste. We cannot just leave, Edgar, she protested. Her ladyship is bedridden and will be of little use as a teacher. You came here to be educated in etiquette, not servitude. I do not know what her ladyship's intentions are, and until I do, I cannot do something so uncouth. She might think I haven't any manners at all. If so, it would also reflect extremely poorly on Edgar. But just look at your hands. Lydia had a great number of scratches on her hands from picking the roses. This is nothing to raise a fuss over, she said, hurriedly hiding them from view. Meanwhile, she wondered whether Edgar had refrained from kissing her because of her current appearance. Perhaps he had been taken aback by the sheer difference between her and the perfect Lucinda. She didn't suppose she could blame him, even if she was technically his fiancée. I'm afraid I still have work to do. Lydia turned on her heel, eager to get away as swiftly as possible. Edgar grabbed her arm to stop her. Just then, from upstairs, there came a scream as grating as the turning of rusty wheels. The cry's echoes lasted for some time before petering out. A horrible clattering sounded at the same time, and it all seemed to be coming from Lady Orchard's room. When Edgar and Lydia arrived, out of breath, Constable was already there. His guest room was situated close to the Countess's chamber. It seemed the older Earl had tried to open the door in the antechamber but found it locked. Do you know what happened? Edgar asked. Constable shot him a disgruntled glance. To his credit, he did give a response, if a little brusquely. No. I did ask through the door, but there wasn't a peep to be heard. Is something the matter? Billy the footman had joined them. It seemed he had also heard the scream at a time when the majority of the servants should have been downstairs. Lydia suspected he had once again been wandering around somewhere instead of performing his duties. It was a wonder that he hadn't been let go yet. The door won't open, Edgar explained, and something might have happened to Lady Orchard. Is there a spare key? I shall call for the butler. Billy quickly turned on his heel. Edgar's eyes were strangely piercing as he watched him go. The butler came at once and unlocked the door. The room was in a hair-raising state, its contents illuminated by the red of the burning fireplace. The chairs and tables had fallen on their sides, the rug had been turned up, and the floor was littered with table clocks, vases, vanity cases, slippers, and whatever else. As for occupants, however, the room was deserted. Seeming oddly composed, Constable approached the inner door to the bedroom itself and flung it open. Lady Orchard. It seemed strange to hear him address his sister as though they were barely acquainted, but perhaps it was a result of their estrangement. However, there came no response, and the bedroom was also a mess. Edgar approached the bed, frowning as he spotted something there. Lydia peered past him. There was a rabbit carcass with a knife stabbed into it. Who would have known that her ladyship was a rabbit all along? No one laughed at Edgar's witticism. Come now, Constable huffed. Where is my dear sister? Her ladyship cannot have left this room, said the butler. It was locked from the inside. What about the window? Edgar asked. It had been left open. Billy took a look out of it. I suppose her ladyship could have jumped onto the second-floor roof and escaped that way. I suppose that is what she must have done. What do you mean escaped? Constable shouted fiercely. What reason would my dear sister have to slaughter a rabbit and then run away? The possibility has been raised. Nothing is certain yet. Edgar studied the dead rabbit. Does this knife belong to her ladyship? I cannot say that I recognize it, the butler replied. This carcass is too cold for it to have been slaughtered when we heard the scream. The knife handle, however, is warm. Someone must have been gripping with so much force that their palm was sweating. Recently, at that. This entire situation is utterly absurd. Who screamed in your version of events exactly? A fairy, Lydia said, speaking for the first time since they had come upon the scene. She was close to wanting to hide as a number of disbelieving gazes fell on her, but Edgar's encouraging nod gave her the courage to continue. I believe that a fairy has been occupying this room and pretending to be Lady Ortred. Her ladyship has been acting oddly for a number of days, isn't that right? It has not been her cooped up in this room, snapping at people, and eating her meals and taking tea, but a fairy. So this fairy was also the one who screamed. Edgar was the only one taking her explanation seriously. Nevertheless, Lydia could only share what she knew. She had picked up on things that only a fairy doctor could. Yes, she continued at pace, someone must have come in here. That intruder stabbed the fairy, which was using magic to disguise itself as Lady Ortred, with that knife. I believe that was the moment it screamed. The attacker must have been so shocked to see who they thought was her ladyship making a mess of the room that they fled. A fairy? Ridiculous. My dear sister is afflicted by an illness that makes her shout suddenly and behave strangely. I can understand why her staff is eager to conceal the truth, but blaming it on fairies is a step too far, wouldn't you say? Constable glared at Lydia and then at the butler before leaving the room. This is a dead fairy, then, and not a rabbit? Billy asked. He seemed to have passed the stage of bewilderment and now sounded amused. The fairy was wearing the rabbit pelt. It lost its temper when its furs were damaged, caused a ruckus, and then vanished. Then what of her ladyship? The butler asked. It seemed he was so concerned about Lady Ortred's disappearance that he was willing to take Lydia's story at face value for the time being. I'm not sure. But if a fairy has taken her ladyship's place, then it is quite possible that she is now in the fairy world. The fairy world? Would her ladyship be safe there? Lydia hesitated. Supposing that she made a promise with the fairy that it might occupy her room, it would consider that promise broken by the intruder's interruption. Fairies do not easily forgive broken contracts. It is possible that it will attempt to harm Lady Ortred. The butler's shoulders drooped as any optimism left him. Let's forget about this fairy business, Billy said. All we know for certain is that someone entered this room with intentions that involved a knife. For instance, murdering her ladyship or stealing her possessions. Edgar turned to the butler. Is there anything missing? The servant glanced around before opening the chest of drawers beside the bed. Her ladyship's regard necklace is missing. It is usually kept safely in this drawer. Might her ladyship be wearing it? It is quite a sizable piece. It is extravagant too, covering the entire chest area of an evening gown, so it would be inconvenient to wear or to carry on one's person on a day-to-day basis. In which case, it holds enough value to appeal to a thief. We ought to check whether her ladyship's other jewelry has been taken. Her ladyship keeps her other jewelry beyond that door. In one corner of the bedroom sat what appeared to be a bronze relief of a rose but was in fact a door. It was so small that an adult would have to stoop to pass through it. Edgar tried what seemed to be the handle to no avail. Locked. I believe the regard necklace itself acts as the key, the butler said. I see. Perhaps that is why it was stolen, although it would seem the thief hadn't the time to unlock this door. Are you sure it is wise to give such information away to her ladyship's guests? That the regard necklace is the key is common knowledge within the estate. Only her ladyship knows the particulars of its use. Edgar looked at the bed again. Then, he approached the window and reached for the latch. How many dark-haired maids do you have at the estate? There are several long, black hairs caught here. They might have been caught during her escape. Lady Ortred doesn't have dark hair, does she? The butler gave a thoughtful nod. I would suggest asking Mrs. Boyle about the maids. Could you call for her, Lydia? Certainly. Lydia gave a small shake of her head at Edgar, who looked like he wanted to make a remark to the man who had just given her such an order. I'll come with you, said Billy. It won't do to let a girl wander about alone when there's a thief on the loose. We ought to call the police too. Edgar glared at the footman but raised no objections. I suppose the possibility is high that the attacker is hanging around. In fact, calling the police should be a priority. At the very least, we should have them find out whether her ladyship is still on the premises or not. The butler took a moment to think things through. If I may, my lord, I think this matter would be better dealt with internally. May I ask that you keep it to yourself for the time being? Naturally we shall search the estate, but we have special instructions from her ladyship on what to do in the event of her sudden disappearance. We are to refrain from notifying anybody for at least a month, lest she finds herself unable to return. Does her ladyship often vanish without a trace? Not Lady Ortred specifically, but the late Lord Ortred would. And there were certain cases from the previous generation. It sounded to Lydia as though this household had been dealing with the Danes for a number of generations. It wasn't unusual for someone to believe they had only been with the fairies for an hour or so and return to find they had been gone from their home for several days. But what if the attacker is still hanging around? Billy asked. Doesn't that mean letting them roam loose? I implore you to follow her ladyship's instructions, Billy, replied the butler. The Ortreds have been dealing with this secret for generations. There is no telling what disaster might befall her ladyship if we attempt to meddle. I am also of the opinion that waiting is the best option, Lydia said. If Lady Ortred had indeed been taken by a fairy, causing a fuss would do more harm than good. It seemed that the Danes had considered these grounds and gardens to be their playground for a long time now. If swathes of people began traipsing through it, they would likely feel their territory was being ravaged. In the worst-case scenario, they would leave altogether, sealing up the entrance to the fairy world and ensuring no human could ever return here. I'm going to investigate as best I can, Billy insisted. It won't take much to catch a petty thief. Those black hairs might have been planted to make it seem like the attacker was a lady, which would only go to cast our guests under suspicion. Taken aback, the butler gave Edgar an apologetic look. Billy made to leave with Lydia in tow. You are rather willful for a mere footman. The wan smile on Edgar's face made it clear that he disliked Billy's attitude. Rather than finding him suspicious, the Earl was incensed about his fiancée being escorted by another man. Supposing the culprit isn't a lady, that puts you under suspicion as well. Billy pretended not to hear him. It ultimately transpired that the regard necklace was the only item missing from Lady Ortred's chamber. The owner of the dark hairs had yet to be identified. There were several maids with such hair at the estate, but they had all been downstairs in the servants' quarters at the time, and there had been no suspicious behavior from any of them. It was dubious whether the necklace had even been stolen or the Countess had it with her. Though every nook and cranny of the estate was searched, there wasn't a clue to be found regarding her whereabouts. As Lydia had been tidying Lady Ortred's chamber that morning, she had been keeping an eye out for anything that might allow her to make contact with the fairy that had been here. Unfortunately, she had yet to find anything worthwhile. She was sitting on the floor, gathering up the petals from the potpourri, when she heard a familiar voice. I've been looking for you, Lydia. What are you doing up here? Nico had slipped in through the window and was standing in front of her haughtily with his paws on his hips. I didn't realize you had followed me to Somerset, Nico. That's a fine way to greet me now, isn't it? I came because I thought you might be lonely out here by yourself. She had been lonely, but after all the chaos since her arrival, that was the least of her worries. "Why are you dressed as a maid? Is this all part of learning to be a lady?" "I suppose it must be. This room is covered in fairy footprints," Nico said, throwing himself into the finest chair there was. "There are even marks on the ceiling and the walls." "Of course, Nico, you are much more sensitive to traces of fairy activity than I am. I believe that the lady of the house might have been kidnapped by Danes, and I wish to talk to them. Would you be able to lend me a hand?" "Danes, is it?" The fairy cat narrowed his eyes and twiddled his whiskers thoughtfully. "They abhor humans. They think you're greedy creatures who are only after their treasure. Get too close to them and they'll immediately treat you like a thief." "But it sounds as if they have been in Lady Orchard's room. I am sure she must have spoken with them." "Without knowledge of their secret, you have no chance of properly conversing with the Danes. They will either completely ignore you or go out of their way to pester you." "That secret being?" "The whereabouts of their treasure, of course. But the only way to find that out is to accidentally overhear it from their conversation." It was doubtful that she could gain their trust without repeating the secret in question back to them. "That reminds me. There is someone else at this estate who has exchanged a contract with the Danes." Lydia turned her gaze out of the window. There, she saw the little path that led to the rose garden. In front of it was a hedge, along which Edgar was walking. Just then, a girl in a red dress ran out from the house. She called out to the Earl, beaming as she addressed him. Eventually, the pair began to walk side by side. Lydia couldn't see Edgar's expression, but she had no doubt that he was wearing a cordial smile. Yesterday, Edgar had claimed that Lucinda had mistaken him as the man she was writing letters to, a man who shared his initials with the Earl. Lydia wondered whether that was all there was to it. He had a particular fondness for women who had taken a liking to him. If nothing else, he was unlikely to spurn any woman who approached him. He likely wasn't thinking too much of the situation. She assumed he thought nothing of smiling at the girl or walking in step with her. Lydia therefore couldn't say she felt upset. Losing her temper and chasing Lucinda away seemed like an overreaction to the girl being in Edgar's room. After all, it wasn't like she had caught them exchanging a kiss. She wasn't upset. But she did feel somewhat dispirited. The girls who approached Edgar tended to be those aglow with confidence, Lydia's total opposite. "The Earl's here too, is he?" Nico remarked as he leaned out of the window. "So, while he's off on a lovely walk with that girl in the red dress, you're stuck here in a maid's uniform to learn etiquette and whatnot? There's no helping it. A girl like Lucinda would have learned how to be a perfect noble wife long ago. All she needed to concern herself with now was her debut. Anyway, Nico, can I ask for your assistance? I'm going to finish tidying up as quickly as possible and then there is somewhere I would like to go." "Excuse me? I am the gentleman and you are the maid. Why should I be assisting you?" "I am desperate, Nico." "Oh, so I am your last resort now, am I?" Once she had finished cleaning Lady Orchard's chamber, Lydia headed for the rose garden with Nico to see Virginia. She pushed through the shrubbery just as she had done yesterday. Before long, the pair were standing in the fairies' rose garden, where the mysterious flowers were in full bloom under a gauze of mist. There didn't seem to be anyone present, so Lydia approached the log cabin. "Hello, Virginia," she called, and the door opened. "Why, Lydia, what a pleasant surprise. Oh, and you've a cat with you." "I'm a fairy, not a cat," Nico said. "You speak, I see. And you walk on your hind legs. I dare say you're a cheeky character." Virginia leaned down to ruffle the fur on Nico's head. It seemed her serenity sapped him of the will to be angry. "She definitely seems the type to live in a fairy's garden of her own volition," the fairy cat grumbled. "It looks like rain. Do come in." The pair entered. Indeed, it wasn't long before a light drizzle started falling outside the window. Nico had taken a seat and was repeatedly smoothing down his fur. Lydia watched as Virginia prepared the rose tea, but the matter at hand was too urgent to wait for her to serve it. "I have something to ask of the Danes," the fairy doctor said. I thought you might have an acquaintance or two among them, given that you have spoken to them a number of times. A troubled frown rose to Virginia's face. I cannot say that my ties to them are all that close. They have taken a liking to my skills with the roses, but when they speak to me, I only hear their voices. They do not show themselves. Does that mean they won't come if you call for them? At times they do, and at others they don't. Something seems to be afoot with them today, however. Though a new rose of mine bloomed this morning, I didn't hear a peep from them. I haven't been able to leave the garden yet either. Placing the rose tea on the table, she pointed at a flower pot by the window. There, a tiny golden rose had bloomed. It was translucent and almost looked like a tortoise shell. The soft petals sprang back against Lydia's fingertip as she touched it. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Thank you. I'm afraid I might know why the fairies have kept their silence." "Why?" "A thief broke into her ladyship's chamber. However, it was not her ladyship, but a fairy who had been cooped up there. All that was left was a rabbit carcass, which the robber had stabbed with a knife. No one knows where her ladyship is, but I was hoping the fairies might." Virginia frowned again as she pondered this. "A knife, you say? How very frightful." "Indeed it is. It would seem that the intruder was either after her ladyship's life or her valuable jewelry. The regard necklace, I presume?" Although it initially struck Lydia as odd that the gardener should know about the pendant, the doubt was swept away as a new voice joined the conversation: a fairy. "Humans are nothing but liars, Virginia." Both women were startled into silence. Nico's ears twitched, his teacup frozen on its way to his mouth. "The promise was broken, and we were chased from that room. We've been friendly with this house's humans for a long, long time. But we cannot trust you anymore. We're going to close this space and leave." "I see," Virginia murmured with a sigh. She must have known that changing the minds of fairies was no mean feat and that neither words nor sentiment would be enough to keep them there. But Lydia was a fairy doctor. It was her job to negotiate with fairies on others' behalf, no matter how difficult the task promised to be. "You are mistaken, Danes. Lady Ortred did not break her promise. It was a thief who entered that room." "A thief? It can't be. We have to hurry or the thief will be at our rose garden. Now I've done it." As panicked as she was, Lydia knew she had to do something. "What about Virginia? A new variety of rose bloomed this morning. I ask that you allow her to leave. The contract was broken last night. Virginia can't leave. At this rate, the gardener would be buried with the rose garden." Lydia had to think of something. Not only that, but if the fairies left, there would be no way to find out where Lady Ortred was, and she too would be trapped somewhere in their domain forevermore. It was all or nothing. Lydia got to her feet, facing herself in the direction of the voice. "Hear me, Danes. I am a fairy doctor and I know your most treasured secret." Nico slammed his teacup down in a panic. "Lydia. What? You do?" The Dane sounded just as flustered as she'd hoped. "All right. Go on and share a wish with us. We'll fulfill it in exchange for our secret." But she couldn't voice a wish yet. Not when she didn't actually know their secret. It was all an attempt to buy them some time. "I haven't thought of one yet. I'm afraid you will need to stay at the estate until I do. If you were to leave before then, I might just let your secret slip." There was a pause. "You have until the dawn after the full moon in 5 days' time. We can't wait longer than that." "Then it's settled," Lydia replied, swallowing her doubts. There then came the sound of tiny footsteps scampering away from the attic above. Nico spoke up after a safe period of silence. "What on earth did you do that for, Lydia? Have you got any idea what'll happen if they find out you lied?" "There was nothing else for it, Nico. We shouldn't have any problems if I find out where their treasure is hidden before they catch on." "Oh, and how do you suppose you'll do that?" The fairy cat was standing on his chair, so irate that he was ruffling up his own head fur in frustration. "You never look before you leap, do you? Your thoughtlessness beggars belief." "But Nico, There was never any way of earning the Danes' cooperation without learning their secret in the first place. Lydia turned to Virginia and smiled. I'm going to get you out of this fix. Don't you worry. You mustn't concern yourself with me, Lydia. I have been coming and going from this garden fully aware of how dangerous it can be to form a deep connection with fairies. It is just a shame that I was never able to see my friend again. Your friend? Virginia's eyes softened wistfully as she stared off into the distance. It wasn't going to be long before she came here. I sent her a letter promising that we would meet once I had cultivated a blue rose. We haven't been able to see each other in 10 years. I promised to grow that rose for her to ensure I never forgot our friendship, even while we were apart. And she promised to come and see me once the rose had bloomed, no matter how difficult it might prove. A blue rose. Lydia had heard before that no one had ever been able to produce a blue rose. Did you manage it? She asked. The gardener stood up and beckoned Lydia outside. At some point the rain had stopped, and a rainbow now stretched over the garden. The pair climbed up a few stone steps to an elevated part of the plot where a single rosebush had been planted. The numerous buds on it were beginning to swell. They will flower when the full moon rises in 5 days' time, and they will undoubtedly be blue. It suddenly struck Lydia that the reason Virginia continued to return to the fairies' garden was because she didn't believe she would be able to cultivate blue roses anywhere else. Despite the danger, she had continued gardening for the Danes to fulfill her promise to her friend. You mustn't come back to this garden again, Lydia. In regard to the Countess, what will be will be. If someone should come to the estate asking after blue roses, please tell them nothing more than that they have bloomed. There was a firm finality to the gardener's tone.